The silence was the first sign that something was wrong. Out in the black, orbiting the pockmarked husk of Tartarus 7, silence was the norm, a constant companion to the low hum of the recycler and the groan of aging metal on Elias Vance's salvage rig, the rust bucket. But this was a different kind of quiet. It was a heavy, profound emptiness that swallowed the familiar sounds of his ship, a silence so complete it felt like the universe was holding its breath. Elias, a man whose life had been a long, slow drift through the forgotten scrapyards of the outer systems, felt the change in his bones. He pushed himself away from the viewport where the gray, cratered moon hung like a skull, its abandoned mining colony a dark scar across its surface. The diagnostic panel was dead, not even a flicker of emergency power. He slapped the console, a useless, reflexive gesture learned from decades of wrestling with stubborn machinery. Nothing. It wasn't a power failure. It was a power void. He floated toward the rig's main airlock, his magnetic boots clanking softly on the deck plating, when a flicker of movement outside caught his eye. It wasn't the distant twinkle of a passing freighter or the glint of orbital debris. This was close. It was a shape, a sliver of impossible blackness against the star field, a thing so dark it seemed to pull the light into itself. There was no engine flare, no communication signal, just a perfect, silent geometry that defied all known ship designs. As he watched, mesmerized, other identical shapes emerged from the void. A silent, obsidian fleet descending upon Tartarus 7, they moved with the unnerving grace of sharks, flowing through the vacuum without propulsion or effort. An alarm, shrill and desperate, finally blared through the rust bucket speakers, powered by a last, dying gasp from the capacitors. Proximity alert. Collision course. But it wasn't a collision. A wave of shimmering energy, colorless and silent, washed over his rig. The emergency lights died, the alarm cut out, and the artificial gravity gave way, leaving him suspended in the sudden, total stillness. He felt a strange, tingling pressure envelop him, a force that seeped through the hull and into his very cells, pulling him, lifting him. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of fractured light was the surface of Tartarus 7, the ruined colony below, being bathed in that same ethereal, silent energy. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a brutal slam. Elias gasped, the recycled air of his rig replaced by the thin, metallic tang of the moon's atmosphere. He was sprawled on the grimy, ore-dusted ground of the colony's main plaza, a place he'd only ever seen through a high-powered scope. His head throbbed, his body ached, and around him, others were stirring. There were miners in their dusty overalls, administrators in their now tattered corporate jumpsuits, the skeletal crew of the colony that had stayed behind to decommission the place. A few hundred souls, all looking as bewildered and broken as he felt. The sky above was wrong. The familiar blackness was now cluttered with the silent, obsidian ships, hanging like malevolent gods in the thin atmosphere. They weren't moving, just watching. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the ground. A sound felt more than heard. It wasn't a voice, not in any language Elias knew, but a projection of pure thought that bloomed inside his mind. Cold and precise. You are the clay. Your fear is the color. Your struggle is the texture. We are the curators. This is the gallery. Create for us. The thought was accompanied by images, Concepts that seared themselves into his brain, canvases of frozen agony, sculptures of pure terror. These beings, the Glimmer as they called themselves, weren't conquerors. They were artists. And the half-dead colony of Tartarus 7 was their new installation. The first masterpiece was unveiled within the hour. A small family, a miner and his partner holding their 2 children, made a break for the shelter of the processing plant. They ran with the desperate, frantic energy of pure survival. But there were no lasers, no bullets, no explosions. One of the obsidian ships drifted lower, and a beam of distorted space, like heat haze, enveloped them. The family's frantic sprint slowed, their limbs twisting into unnatural angles, their bodies elongated, their faces contorting, not in pain, but in a perfect, crystallized expression of absolute horror. The man's arms reached for a child who was no longer there. His wife's head was thrown back in a silent, unending scream. The shimmering field around them solidified, capturing the moment forever. They were a statue now, a grotesque monument to despair, left standing in the middle of the dusty street. The psychic hum returned, a wave of cold. Intellectual appreciation, a promising start. The medium is vibrant, the humans scattered. This was a truth far worse than any simple hunt. To be killed was one thing, to be turned into a permanent, screaming effigy of your own death was another. Elias didn't run with the panicked crowd. His salvager's instincts, honed by years of navigating collapsing wrecks and death-trap debris fields, took over. He scrambled not for the open shelters, but for the shadows, for the guts of the colony. He slipped into a maintenance conduit, the smell of ozone and rust a familiar comfort. He was no soldier, no hero. He was a mechanic, a man who understood how things worked and, more importantly, how they broke. He crawled through the tight, dark spaces, the sounds of distant, abruptly silent screams echoing through the metal tunnels. He saw it happen twice more through rusted grates. A lone man, trying to fight back with a heavy wrench, was compressed into a perfect, dense cube of flesh and metal, his defiant glare forever locked in the shimmering stasis. A group huddled in prayer was melted together, their forms flowing into one another like wax, their faces a chorus of serene, empty faith turned into an obscene sculpture. The Glimmer weren't just killing them, they were interpreting them, using their final moments as a creative statement. This wasn't a hunt, it was a harvest of emotion. Elias pushed deeper into the labyrinthine tunnels, his mind racing. The Glimmer were elegant, precise, and utterly alien. They saw the world as a canvas, and people as paint. They floated above the fray, manipulating reality from their sterile, silent ships. They were artists, detached and observant, and that, Elias realized, was their weakness. An artist doesn't expect the clay to fight back. He found a small group huddled in a junction for a geothermal vent, the residual heat a small comfort against the moon's chill. There were 5 of them, their faces pale with terror in the dim glow of a single functioning emergency strip. One of them, a woman with a hard, lined face and the calloused hands of a foreman, held a plasma cutter clutched to her chest like a holy relic. Her name was Anya. Beside her, a young man, barely out of his teens, was shaking uncontrollably. His geologist's kit spilled at his feet. They looked at Elias with wide, hopeless eyes. They're turning people into statues. The young man, Ben, whispered, his voice cracking, just freezing them. Anya didn't speak, her jaw set in a line of grim defiance. She just stared at the plasma cutter in her hands, its power cell nearly depleted. They were prey, waiting for their turn to be collected, to become another piece in a gallery of nightmares. But Elias wasn't seeing a tomb anymore. He was seeing a workshop. He looked at the thick, high-voltage cables running along the ceiling, the massive hydraulic pistons of a disabled rock crusher visible through a service hatch, the network of volatile gas pipes for the now-defunct mining operations. The colony wasn't just a graveyard. It was an arsenal. The Glimmer had made a fatal error. They had chosen a scrapyard for their gallery, and they'd left the salvager alive. He looked from the tools of industry to the terrified faces in the gloom, and then back to the humming silence above. A new kind of thought began to form in his mind, a cold, hard piece of logic forged in the lonely darkness of space. You don't reason with an artist. You don't plead with them. You ruin their canvas. You smash their sculptures. You take their delicate tools and you turn them into brutal, ugly weapons. He reached out and took the plasma cutter from Anya's unresisting hands. His own fingers, scarred and sure, finding the grip. He checked the charge, his movements efficient and practiced. It was low, but it would do. For a start, he ignited it. The hiss and the sudden, brilliant blue-white light cutting through the darkness, making them all flinch. The low hum of the tool was an angry, defiant sound in the suffocating silence. Elias looked at the small, terrified group, his face illuminated by the plasma's glare, his expression no longer one of fear, but of cold, calculating purpose. "They want to make art," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Fine. We'll give them a masterpiece, and we'll build it from their own broken pieces." The blue-white glare of the plasma cutter threw their shadows, long and dancing, against the corrugated metal walls of the geothermal junction. For a moment, no one moved. Ben, the young geologist, stared at the incandescent tip of the tool as if it were the heart of a new star, a single point of defiance in an otherwise dead universe. Anya's hard expression softened for a fraction of a second, not with hope, but with a flicker of raw, desperate curiosity. The other three survivors, a grizzled ore hauler named Kale and two quiet technicians, shifted their weight, their fear momentarily eclipsed by the sheer audacity of Elias Vance's voice. He had not offered them comfort or escape. He had offered them a purpose. He had given their impending deaths a new, violent shape. "How?" Anya's voice was low and practical, cutting through the awe. "We have one of these." She nodded at the plasma cutter. "With maybe 10 minutes of charge. They have that." She gestured vaguely upwards to the silent, reality-bending ships that hung in the sky like holes in the world. Elias extinguished the cutter, plunging them back into the dim glow of the emergency strip. The sudden return to near darkness felt tactical, intimate. "They're artists," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "What does an artist do? They observe. They choose a medium. They apply a tool. They are deliberate. They are not soldiers fighting a war. They are collectors arranging a display." He tapped his temple. "That psychic hum, it's not just a command. It's a broadcast. They're sharing their work. And when they work, they focus. They get lost in the details." He looked at Ben. "You're a geologist. You know this colony better than the people who built it. Where are the old survey tunnels, the ones that aren't on the official schematics? Ben, jolted by the direct question, stammered for a moment. The deep bores, near the old selenium deposits. They were deemed unstable, sealed off decades ago. They run right under the main processing plant and come up near the northern comms relay. A map was slowly forming in Elias's mind, a network of forgotten paths and hidden spaces. He turned to Anya. You were a foreman. You know the machinery, the seismic drills, the magnetic ore separators, the primary power conduits. They shut the main reactor down, but the capacitor banks, they'd still hold a residual charge, wouldn't they? Anya's eyes narrowed in understanding. Enough to jumpstart a small city for about 5 seconds. Or, a grim smile touched her lips. Enough to blow a hole in something. Exactly, Elias said. We're not going to fight their ships. We're going to fight their canvas. His plan, as it unfolded in the cramped, humid darkness, was one of pure industrial sabotage. It was a salvager's dream of deconstruction. The Glimmer were focused on the surface, on the visible human drama. They had ignored the miles of tunnels, the dormant machinery, the literal and figurative underworld of the colony that was now their only advantage. Their first objective was simple: gather resources and information. They would become ghosts in the machine of the colony, moving through the unstable bore tunnels Ben had described, mapping the Glimmer's patterns from the shadows. For 2 full lunar cycles, they moved. They were no longer a huddle of terrified prey, but a functioning unit, bound by Elias's cold logic and Anya's fierce pragmatism. Ben's knowledge of the deep tunnels proved invaluable, allowing them to navigate the labyrinth beneath the colony without ever surfacing. They found small pockets of other survivors, drawing them into their nascent resistance, not with speeches, but with the promise of action. Their numbers grew to 20, then 30. They were a ragged crew of engineers, miners, and geeks, people who understood systems and stress points, while the Glimmer continued their gruesome artistry on the surface, snatching isolated stragglers and transforming them into static nightmares. Elias's crew was stripping the colony's corpse for parts. Anya led teams on daring raids into maintenance depots, hauling back heavy-duty power cells, spools of superconducting wire, and laser-focusing arrays from decommissioned ore scanners. Kale, the old hauler, used his knowledge of the cargo transit system to move equipment silently through the pneumatic tube network that crisscrossed the underground. Elias' son, meanwhile, worked in a makeshift workshop deep in a cavernous pump station, the air thick with the smell of welding and ozone. He wasn't building bombs in the traditional sense. He was building tools of disruption. He tinkered with the magnetic resonators from the ore separators, trying to find a frequency that would interfere with the Glimmer's stasis fields. He jury-rigged a series of seismic charges, not to create a big explosion, but to generate a specific, low-frequency vibration, a deep, resonant hum that might distract the watchers in the sky. It was during one of these observation runs, peering through a cracked foundation into the main plaza, that the next phase of the plan solidified. The Glimmer had arranged their sculptures in a deliberate pattern, a grotesque garden of human agony. At its center was the first one, the family, their faces a permanent, silent testament to the moment their world ended. Elias felt a cold anger watching them, but it was a practical anger. The statue was a focal point, It was an anchor for the Glimmer's aesthetic. To attack it would be more than an act of destruction, it would be an act of blasphemy. Their energy field is self-contained around each piece, he explained back in the workshop, pointing to a crude schematic he'd drawn on a metal plate with a piece of chalk. But they have to be receiving a maintenance signal from the ships, a constant frequency to keep the stasis from degrading. It's like a trickle charge for a battery. If we can find that frequency and overload it, we might be able to shatter the field. Anya looked at the device he was building. It was an ugly thing, a chaotic assembly of capacitors, focusing lenses, and raw copper coils wrapped around the magnetic core of a survey drill. You think this junk can do that? It's not about power, Elias countered, tightening a final bolt. It's about resonance, like a singer shattering a glass with the right note. We're not trying to blow it up. We're trying to make it sing itself to death. The plan was set for the next twilight, the long, dim period when the distant sun was eclipsed by Tartarus VII's gas giant parent, casting the moon in a deep, purple gloom. Benton's team would set off a series of seismic charges in the abandoned selenium mines on the far side of the colony. It wouldn't be a large explosion, but it would cause a significant sustained tremor, a geological anomaly that the Glimmer's analytical minds would be compelled to investigate. While their attention was diverted, Elias, Anya, and a small team would move through the service tunnels beneath the main plaza, deploy their resonator, and, hopefully, shatter the Glimmer's first and most prized creation. The tremor started exactly on schedule, a low, gut-rumbling vibration that made the dust dance on the tunnel floor. Through their periscope, they could see 3 of the obsidian ships drift slowly toward the east, their attention clearly drawn by the unexpected geological event. The psychic hum in their minds shifted, the frequency changing from a tone of detached observation to one of mild, academic curiosity. It was their window. Moving through the final access tunnel, they were a study in silent efficiency. Kyle popped the manhole cover, his massive frame providing a shield. Anya and another technician hauled the heavy resonator, a 60-pound monstrosity of wires and repurposed metal, onto the surface. Elias, carrying the control unit and the power pack, scrambled out last, his eyes immediately scanning the plaza. It was eerily silent, the only light coming from the faint, internal shimmer of the statues themselves. The air was thin and cold. They had 90 seconds. They positioned the device, aiming the focusing array directly at the frozen tableau of the family. Elias connected the power pack, his fingers flying across the makeshift controls, dialing in the frequency he'd spent weeks calculating. "It's armed," he whispered into his comms. "Get back. All of you." Anya and the others scrambled back towards the manhole as Elias made the final connection. He flipped a heavy, industrial switch. The resonator hummed to life, a deep, guttural thrum that was the antithesis of the Glimmer's elegant psychic tone. A beam of barely visible, distorted energy shot from the device and enveloped the statue. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the shimmering stasis field around the family began to flicker, rapidly at first, then violently. The air crackled with static. A high-pitched whine began to emanate from the statue, as if the frozen air itself was screaming. But the field didn't shatter. Instead, it warped. The figures inside began to distort, their frozen forms twisting and melting like plastic held to a flame. The man's outstretched arm dripped towards the ground, his wife's screaming face elongating into a horrifying caricature. It wasn't freedom, it was a different kind of desecration. Suddenly, the psychic hum in Elias's head changed. The academic curiosity vanished, replaced by a spike of pure, cold fury. It was the psychic shriek of a master artist watching his canvas being set on fire. A shadow fell over the plaza. One of the ships had returned, moving with a speed they hadn't thought possible. It wasn't observing anymore. "Elias, get out of there!" Anya screamed from the tunnel opening. But he was frozen, mesmerized by the data scrolling across his control unit. The feedback loop from the disrupted stasis field was feeding him information, showing him the exact frequency. The carrier wave, the architecture of the Glimmer's energy network. He had found the note. He knew how to break the glass. A new beam of energy lanced down from the ship. It wasn't the shimmering artistic stasis field. This was a weapon. It was a concentrated bolt of kinetic force that struck the resonator, vaporizing it in a flash of incandescent light. The resulting shock wave threw Elias backward, his body slamming into the hard-packed dust 20 feet away. The world spun, his ears ringing with the thunderous clap of the explosion. He scrambled to his feet, his side screaming in protest, and sprinted for the manhole, diving headfirst into the darkness just as Kyle slammed the heavy metal cover shut. The last thing he saw was the ship hovering over the plaza, its cold, analytical gaze now fixed on the spot where they had been, and the distorted and melting statue of the family, which had finally begun to crumble into a pile of gray, shimmering dust. They had failed to destroy it cleanly. They had made a mess. They had pissed off the gods. Back in the relative safety of the tunnels, bruised and bleeding, Elias didn't look defeated. He looked alive. He clutched the damaged control unit to his chest. Its screen cracked but still faintly glowing. He had their frequency. He had the architecture of their network. They had poked the artist with a stick, and the artist had revealed the composition of its skin. "They're not just broadcasting," he rasped, a grin spreading across his dust-caked face as he showed the flickering screen to Anya. "It's a network. Every ship, every statue, they're all connected. It's a closed system." Anya wiped a smear of blood from her brow. "What does that mean?" Elias's grin widened, his eyes glinting with a dangerous salvager's light. "It means they've built us a gallery with a state-of-the-art communication system, and we're about to hijack it. We're done smashing sculptures one at a time. We're going to broadcast something of our own, a new exhibit. And the only thing on display will be pure, unfiltered human noise." The failure in the plaza had changed the equation. The Glimmer were no longer detached observers. They were irritated proprietors. Their psychic hum, once a constant, almost ambient presence, now carried a distinct undercurrent of scrutiny. On the surface, new sculptures appeared with unsettling speed, no longer focused on moments of terror, but on acts of compliance. A man kneeling in surrender was frozen, his form polished to a mirror-like sheen. A woman offering a piece of scavenged metal as a tribute was encased in a flawless crystal prism. The Glimmer were no longer just making art about fear. They were making art about submission, a clear, cold message to any who might still be hiding. Down below, the resistance tasted the Glimmer's anger in a more tangible form. Probes, small, spider-like drones of the same obsidian material as the ships, began to descend into the colony's larger ventilation shafts, their multifaceted lenses glowing with a faint, analytical light, they moved slowly, methodically, mapping the underworld that Elias and his people had made their home. The ghosts in the machine were being hunted. The workshop in the pump station became a hive of frantic activity. The data Elias had captured from the resonator's feedback loop was their Rosetta Stone, and Ben, the young geologist, revealed a hidden talent for xenolinguistics and signal processing. He worked tirelessly, his face illuminated by the green glow of a salvaged data screen, trying to crack the intricate, fractal-like code of the Glimmer's network. "It's not just a communication signal," Ben explained, pointing a trembling finger at a cascading waterfall of alien symbols. "It's organic. It grows. It learns. Every time they create a new stasis field, it adds a layer of complexity to the network. It's like they're building a brain, and each sculpture is a neuron." Elias saw it differently. If it's a brain, it can be given a migraine. A big, screaming, system-crashing one. His new plan was far more ambitious and infinitely more dangerous than the first. He wasn't going to try and destroy the network. He was going to infect it. He was going to inject a signal so chaotic, so fundamentally human, that the Glimmer's elegant, ordered system wouldn't be able to process it. It would be the digital equivalent of throwing a bucket of paint at the Mona Lisa. The paint would be a broadcast. Anya and her teams were tasked with finding and reactivating the colony's old emergency broadcast system. The main comms relay on the northern ridge was too exposed, but the colony was also riddled with smaller, short-range transmitters used for internal communication between mining zones. They were low power, but if they could be linked together and their output focused, they could create a directional pulse of electromagnetic energy. The target of that pulse would be the comms relay itself. They wouldn't try to use it. They would use it as a lightning rod. "The relay is a massive antenna," Elias reasoned, sketching in the dust. "The Glimmer have probably left its core systems dormant, but the physical structure is still there. If we hit it with a concentrated burst of energy, modulated with our own signal, the antenna will resonate. It will absorb our broadcast and then re-radiate it in all directions. A shockwave of pure static. And, since the Glimmer ships are hovering right over it, they'll be at ground zero of an electromagnetic storm." Anya finished, a flicker of appreciation in her eyes. "It might not destroy them, but it'll blind them, fry their delicate sensors." "It'll do more than that," Ben added, looking up from his screen. "I think I've found a loophole in their network protocol, a backdoor. It's designed for diagnostic signals to reboot a corrupted stasis field from the network. If we can mimic the handshake for that protocol and inject our signal there, we don't just blind them," Elias said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "We force them to listen." The next week was a desperate race against the Glimmer's encroaching probes. 2 survivors were lost when a probe cornered them in a narrow conduit, its stasis beam freezing them into a compressed, intertwined sculpture of metallic gray. The loss sent a chill through the resistance, a stark reminder of the stakes. They sealed off entire sections of the tunnels, creating choke points and traps using repurposed mining equipment, turning their sanctuary into a fortified labyrinth. While the others worked, Elias sat in a quiet corner, trying to decide what their signal should be. What was the perfect noise to break the mind of a godlike artist? Not a demand for freedom, not a cry for help. It had to be something that struck at the core of what the Glimmer were, beings of pure, cold intellect. He gathered the survivors, He didn't ask them to record messages of defiance. He asked for something far more personal. He recorded Kale, the gruff ore hauler, telling a crude, rambling joke about a spacefarer and a three-headed Glarzon, and the raucous, genuine laughter of the others who heard it. He recorded Anya humming a lullaby, a sad, simple tune from a world she would never see again. He recorded Ben nervously reciting the geological composition of Tartarus 7, his voice filled with an academic passion that was utterly at odds with their situation. He recorded arguments, whispers, a baby crying from a recording one of the technicians had kept on a data slate, the sound of a wrench tightening a bolt, the hiss of the plasma cutter. He layered it all together, a chaotic, unstructured symphony of human existence. It wasn't a message. It was a cross-section of a soul, messy, illogical, and beautiful. This would be their masterpiece. The day of the broadcast arrived. The plan was a complex, multi-part operation. One team, led by Kyle, would create a diversion, using the last of their seismic charges to simulate a tunnel collapse near the southern perimeter, drawing the Glimmer's probes and hopefully the attention of the ships. The main team, led by Elias and Anya, would transport their jury-rigged broadcast rig to a position just below the northern comms relay. The rig was another of Elias's monstrous creations, the linked transmitters, powered by a bank of dangerously overloaded capacitor cells, all focused through a concave dish made from the polished hull of a wrecked escape pod. It was ugly, unstable, and their only hope. They moved through the final tunnel, the weight of the equipment and their own tension making every step a monumental effort. They could hear the distant, muffled thuds of Kale's diversion. Peering through a grate, they saw two of the Obsidian ships drift south, their attention captured. Now was the time. Emerging into the purple twilight on the northern ridge was like stepping onto another world. The comms relay towered above them, a skeletal lattice of rusting metal against the swirling, gaseous backdrop of the parent planet. The air was thin, and the silence up here was absolute. They worked with a desperate, focused haste, assembling the broadcast rig, aiming the dish, connecting the power source. Ben, hunched over his data slate, worked to establish the digital handshake with the Glimmer network. "They're taking the bait," he whispered, his eyes wide. "Their network is pinging the southern sector, analyzing the tremors. The diagnostic port is open. I'm in." "Anya, how's the power?" Elias asked, his hands hovering over the broadcast controls. "The capacitors are redlining. We've got maybe 20 seconds once we fire it up before they blow." She replied, her voice tight. "That's 19 seconds more than we need," Elias said. "On my mark." He looked out across the ruined colony, a graveyard of art made from his people. He thought of the laughter, the lullaby, the whispered hopes and pointless arguments he had woven into a signal. "Mark." Anya slammed the final connection home. The rig screamed to life, the air around the dish shimmering with raw power. "Broadcasting," Ben yelled, typing frantically. Elias pushed the master control forward. For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the machine. Then, the comms relay above them began to glow, a faint, ethereal blue light dancing along its metallic bones. It had become their tuning fork. In the sky, the Glimmer ship stopped. Their slow, graceful drift ceased, and then the psychic hum in their heads changed. The cold, analytical tone was gone, replaced by a wave of something utterly alien confusion. It was a discordant, chaotic static, as if 1,000 voices were screaming at once in their minds. The broadcast was working. The symphony of human noise was flooding their perfect, ordered network. The ships began to drift erratically, their precise formations breaking. One of them tilted at an unnatural angle, as if stunned. "It's working!" Ben shouted, a triumphant grin on his face. But their victory was short-lived. The capacitors on the rig began to whine, the pitch rising to a piercing shriek. "It's going to blow," Anya screamed, pulling at Elias's arm. "We have to go." But Elias was watching the sky. One of the ships, the one closest to them, was righting itself. It had weathered the initial shock, and it was turning, its featureless black hull now aimed directly at their position. The psychic static in their minds focused, coalescing into a single, piercing spike of pure, incandescent rage. The artist had not just been offended, it had been driven mad. "Run," Elias breathed. A beam of energy, far more powerful than the one that had destroyed the resonator, shot down from the ship. It wasn't a kinetic blast or a stasis field. It was a wave of pure, unmaking energy, a tool designed not to capture or sculpt, but to erase. The beam struck the comms relay. The massive metal structure didn't explode. It simply dissolved, turning to a cloud of incandescent dust in a silent, terrifying flash. The shockwave of displaced air hit them like a physical blow, throwing them from their feet and sending them tumbling down the rocky slope of the ridge. Elias's last conscious thought was of the psychic scream in his head, a sound of pure, hateful agony. He had not just ruined the Glimmer's canvas, he had broken their minds. And now, they had abandoned art altogether. All that was left was the rage. The world returned as a symphony of pain. Elias's first sensation was the sharp, grinding protest of his own ribs as he tried to draw a breath. The air tasted of ionized dust and ozone. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming, and took in the aftermath. The northern ridge was gone. In its place was a gaping, glassy crater, still glowing with a faint, residual heat. The comms relay, their jury-rigged broadcast rig, all of it had been utterly and completely erased from existence. He had wanted to make noise. The Glimmer had answered with absolute silence. Anya was slumped against a rock nearby, a deep gash on her forehead, bleeding freely into her matted hair. But she was alive. Her gaze fixed on the sky with a mixture of terror and awe. Ben was further down the slope, being helped to his feet by Kyle, who had arrived with the diversion team. Their faces a mask of disbelief at the scale of the devastation. The sky was the most telling change. The Glimmer ships were no longer floating in their detached, artistic formations. They were moving in tight, aggressive patterns, like a fleet of warships on high alert. The psychic hum that had been a constant backdrop to their existence was gone, replaced by a chilling, predatory silence. The network they had so carefully infected was now offline. They had poked the Leviathan, and now the Leviathan was awake. "What did we do?" "Elias," Anya murmured, her voice hoarse. "What did they become?" "They became what we are," Elias rasped, spitting a mouthful of bloody dust. "They became survivors, and now they're angry." Their victory, if it could be called that, had been Pyrrhic. They had proven the Glimmer could be hurt, that their minds could be broken, But in doing so, they had transformed their captors from detached, alien artists into something far more familiar and far more dangerous, a wounded animal. And a wounded animal is at its most unpredictable. The hunt began in earnest. The spider-like probes were gone, replaced by larger, sleeker hunter drones that moved with terrifying speed through the tunnels. They didn't use stasis fields anymore. They used lances of the same unmaking energy that had obliterated the ridge, carving through walls and bulkheads as if they were paper. The underground was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a tomb, and the walls were closing in. The survivors were forced into a desperate, running retreat, abandoning their workshop, their supply caches, their home. They were pushed deeper into the unstable, forgotten sections of the mines, the air growing thin and stale, their numbers dwindling with each new attack. The Glimmer were no longer making art. They were exterminating an infestation. It was during a brief respite in a cavern filled with giant, phosphorescent crystals that their new reality truly sank in. They had lost nearly a third of their people in the last cycle. Their supplies were almost gone. Hope, a currency they had hoarded more carefully than power cells, was bankrupt. Despair hung in the air, thick and cloying. "We can't win," Ben said, his voice hollow. He had been a boy of science and wonder, but the Glimmer's rage had burned that out of him, leaving only a core of cold, hard data. Their energy output is exponentially higher than before. Their tactics are adaptive. They're learning. And they're not just trying to capture us. They're trying to wipe us out. Elias looked at the faces around him, illuminated by the eerie, pulsing light of the crystals. He saw exhaustion. He saw defeat. He saw the end. He had led these people, promised them a way to fight back. And all he had delivered was a faster, more violent death. His plan to ruin the canvas had worked too well. Now the artist was burning down the entire museum with them inside it. But as he looked at the intricate crystalline structures around them, a new idea began to form. A final, desperate gambit born from a salvager's core principle: everything has a purpose, especially the junk. "Ben," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "These crystals, what are they?" Ben looked up, his expression dull. "Selenite, common on Tartarus 7. They form in these geothermal vents. They have unique piezoelectric properties, but they're too unstable for industrial use. They amplify and store energy, but they shatter if you overload them." "Amplify and store energy," Elias repeated, a strange light coming into his eyes. He walked over to one of the giant, translucent pillars and placed his hand on its smooth, cool surface. He could feel a faint vibration, a low thrum of energy from the planet's core. "Anya, the last of the seismic charges. How powerful are they?" Anya looked at him, confused. "Not very. Enough to crack a rock face. Maybe. We used the big ones for the diversion." I don't need to crack a rock face," Elias said, his gaze sweeping across the cavern, which was a veritable forest of the giant selenite formations. "I need to ring a bell." His final plan was the epitome of his life's philosophy. It was ugly. It was brutal. And it involved turning the very thing of beauty in their world into a weapon. The entire cavern of crystals, he reasoned, was a giant, naturally occurring capacitor. The seismic charges, if placed at the precise resonant frequency points of the largest crystals, wouldn't just shatter them. They would cause a catastrophic energy release. They would be turning the entire cavern into a massive, planet-cracking bomb. But it wasn't a bomb meant for the ships. It was bait. "They're hunting us with scanners," he explained, his voice echoing in the vast, crystalline space. "Thermal, kinetic, biological. They're looking for us, so we'll give them something to find. We're going to light this place up like a sun. We'll overload the crystals, create an energy signature so massive, so irresistible, they'll have to come down here to see what it is. They'll come down here and unmake us all," Kyle grumbled, his voice a low rumble of doubt. "Exactly," Elias said. "They'll send their hunter drones, dozens of them, maybe even more. They'll pour all their available resources into this cavern to neutralize the threat. And when they're all in here, when they're all focused on the big, beautiful light," he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We bring the ceiling down on top of them." The plan was, in essence, a suicide mission, but it was a suicide mission with a purpose. While Elias and a small team of volunteers, Anya, Ben, and Kale among them, rigged the cavern, the rest of the survivors, led by one of Anya's most trusted technicians, would make a break for the one place on Tartarus 7 the Glimmer would have no reason to be watching the rust bucket. Elias's old salvage rig was still where it had been captured, in a low, decaying orbit, its systems dead, but it wasn't destroyed. The primary life support and the navigation systems run on an independent power cycle, he explained to the technician, pressing a battered data chip into his hand. "This has the reboot codes. It'll be cold, it'll be dark, and you'll only have one shot at firing up the main drive to get you clear, but it's a way out." There were no grand speeches, no tearful goodbyes. There was only a quiet, grim understanding. They were the bait. They were the distraction that would buy the others their freedom. As they worked, setting the charges, a strange sense of peace settled over Elias. He was a salvager. His job was to find value in the broken, to pull life from the dead. He was about to perform his final, his greatest act of salvage, trading his own life and the lives of his friends for the future of the others. They gave the escape party a 2-hour head start. Then they began the process. It started with a single, carefully placed charge at the base of the cavern's largest crystal, the Heartstone, as Ben had called it. The small explosion didn't shatter it, but sent a deep, resonant thrum through the cavern. A single, pure note. The other crystals picked up the vibration, their phosphorescent glow intensifying. The cavern began to sing. On a salvaged scanner, Ben watched the energy readings spike. "They see it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Oh, they see it. Energy signature is off the charts. And, yes, multiple contacts descending. Fast." Elias looked at Anya, at Kyle. Their faces were calm, resolute. They had made their choice. They stood together in the glowing, humming heart of their trap. The hunter drones poured into the cavern through fissures in the ceiling. Sleek, black shapes against the brilliant, pulsing light of the crystals. There were dozens of them, more than they had ever seen in one place. They swarmed into the cavern, their sensors locking onto the overloaded Heartstone, the source of the impossible energy readings. They ignored the four small biological signatures huddled at the edge of the cavern. They were focused on the art of the problem. Elias held a detonator in his hand. A simple pressure-activated switch connected to the main charges they had planted in the cavern's ceiling, in the load-bearing rock formations they had identified earlier. He waited. He watched as the drones surrounded the Heartstone, their energy lances beginning to glow as they prepared to neutralize the threat. He let them get comfortable. He let them think they had it under control. He looked at Anya and saw her nod. He looked at Kyle, who gave him a grim final smile. In that moment, he felt a strange connection to the glimmer. He, too, had chosen his medium. He, too, was about to make a final, definitive statement. His masterpiece was not one of despair or submission. It was a masterpiece of defiance. It was a monument built of collapsing rock and vaporized alien technology. He squeezed the detonator. The last thing he heard was the deafening final chord of the cavern singing itself to death. The universe did not end with a bang, but with a song, a deep, resonant chord that vibrated not through the air, but through the very rock beneath them. Lena felt it in her teeth, in the marrow of her bones. She was a systems technician, a woman who understood the clean logic of circuits and code. But this was a different kind of energy, something primal and absolute. She and the 23 other survivors were scrambling through the last of the deep bore tunnels, their lungs burning, their bodies bruised, their hearts hammering a desperate rhythm against their ribs. The ground bucked, throwing them against the tunnel walls. Above them, miles of solid rock groaned in protest. The cavern was singing its death song, and they were running from the choir when they finally emerged, gasping into the thin, frigid air of the lunar surface. The world was bathed in an impossible, silent light. It poured from a new fissure in the ground, miles away. A brilliant, terrifying column of pure energy that reached for the heavens. The ghost of the selenite cavern screaming its defiance into the void. The glimmer ships, once so precise and controlled, were in disarray. Some hung motionless, stunned by the sheer magnitude of the energy release. Others drifted aimlessly. The trap had been sprung. Elias had given them their chance. Lena didn't waste a second marveling at the spectacle. Her focus was singular, a point of rusted, ugly metal hanging in the star-dusted blackness above the rust bucket. "This way," she commanded, her voice raw. "Move. Now." The journey across the pockmarked plains to the dormant orbital elevator was a nightmare of stumbling haste. They were exposed, visible, every shadow a potential threat. But no hunter drones came. No beams of unmaking energy lanced down. The glimmer were, for the moment, completely and utterly preoccupied with the wound that had been torn in the planet beneath them. They had focused so intently on the source of the beautiful, terrible light that they had forgotten about the mice scurrying away in the darkness. The elevator car was a relic, powered by a sputtering, independent generator. It groaned and shuddered its way up the carbon nanotube tether, a slow, agonizing ascent into the heavens. With every foot they climbed, Tartarus 7 shrank below them, a scarred, gray orb now marked by two glowing wounds, the glassy crater of the comms relay, and the pulsing, incandescent fissure of the collapsed cavern. It was a map of their resistance, written in fire and sacrifice. Docking with the rust bucket was a clumsy, manual affair. The rig was a ghost ship, its hull cold to the touch, its interior a pitch-black crypt smelling of stale air and cold metal. Emergency lights flickered weakly as they cycled the airlock, casting long, monstrous shadows. They were aboard. They were safe from the moon, but they were a dead ship in a hostile system, a metal coffin waiting for a burial. Lena went straight to the bridge. The data chip Elias had given her clutched in her hand. The bridge was small, cluttered, and deeply personal. A faded photo was magnetized to one of the consoles. A smiling woman and child Lena didn't recognize. A half-finished mug of synth coffee was still strapped to a holder. This was his space, his home, and he had given it to them. She slid the chip into the primary console. "Everyone, brace yourselves," she said over the internal comms. "I'm attempting a cold reboot of the main reactor. It's going to be a rough start." She followed the sequence from the chip, her fingers dancing over the cold. Dead controls. The ship groaned, a deep, shuddering sound of ancient machinery being forced back to life. Lights flickered violently. The low hum of the life support system coughed and sputtered, then caught, filling the ship with a welcome, gentle breeze. On the main view screen, the image of Tartarus 7 resolved itself, a sight that sent a fresh wave of grief and terror through her. The glimmer ships were moving again, but they weren't searching. They weren't hunting. They were forming a perfect, geometric pattern high above the moon's equator. They were preparing for the final act of erasure. A single, impossibly bright beam of energy lanced down from the lead ship, striking the surface. It didn't explode. It simply deleted. A perfect circle of the moon's crust, miles in diameter, vanished, leaving behind a glowing, molten lake of glass. The glimmer were systematically unmaking the entire moon, wiping their canvas clean of every last speck of dust, every last memory. They were salting the earth. "The main drive is charging," one of the other technicians called out from the engine room, his voice tight with panic. "But it needs at least 5 more minutes to prime the FTL coils. We don't have 5 minutes." He was right. A second and third beam joined the first. The Glimmer fleet beginning a slow, methodical crawl across the surface, their cleansing fire getting closer and closer to the orbital tether, to the wreckages of the colony, to the graves of their friends. They were wiping away the proof that anyone had ever been here at all. Then, one of the black ships broke formation. It turned, its featureless hull glinting in the light of its own destruction, and began to move directly toward the rust bucket. They had been seen. The hum of the active scanners on the bridge confirmed it. The wounded artist had found one last, ugly little smear on the edge of its frame, and it was coming to wipe it clean. Panic flared through the ship. "We can't outrun it. We have no weapons." Someone cried over the comms. Lena's mind raced. They were a salvage rig, a junk hauler. Elias had been a salvager. He didn't fight with weapons. He fought with whatever was at hand. He fought with noise. Her eyes fell on the data chip, still plugged into the console. The reboot sequence was complete, but she knew what else was on that chip. Elias had saved everything. "Get me a direct link to the main comms array," she ordered, her voice cutting through the panic with cold authority. "Bypass all safety protocols and channel the reactor's pre-charge output directly into the transmitter." The technician on the other end hesitated. "Lena, that'll blow every fuse on this rig. We might not have enough power left to jump." "Just do it," she snapped. She pulled up the file. It was labeled simply noise. The chaotic symphony of human existence Elias had crafted. The laughter, the lullaby, the arguments, the passion, the beautiful, illogical mess of it all. It had driven them mad once. Maybe, just maybe, it could do it again. The glimmer ship was closing fast, a silent, obsidian angel of death. A port on its underside began to glow, the telltale sign of its unmaking beam powering up. Link established. The technician's voice crackled. You're hot. Lena took a deep breath. She looked at the photo of the unknown woman and child, at the half-empty coffee mug. She thought of Elias, Anya, Ben, and Kyle. Not as statues, but as a cacophony of voices, now silent. This is for you, she thought. She hit broadcast. A wave of pure, concentrated humanity slammed into the approaching glimmer ship. The rust bucket shuddered as its comms array fired a blast of raw data and sound, a digital scream into the void. The effect on the glimmer ship was immediate and violent. It shuddered, its smooth, effortless glide suddenly becoming erratic. The glowing port flickered, and the unmaking beam that lanced out was unstable, unfocused. It sliced through the blackness 100 yards to their port side, a near miss that was too close for comfort and too far to be anything but a sign of its pilot's agony. The ship began to tumble, end over end, as if its internal guidance system was at war with itself. No psychic scream came this time. There was only a profound and sudden silence. The silence of a mind that has been utterly and irrevocably broken. It had been one thing to receive the noise through its network, buffered and filtered through a system. It was another thing entirely to have it injected directly into its consciousness at point-blank range. "Drive is primed," the technician screamed. "We're ready to jump." Lena didn't need to be told twice. She slammed her hand down on the FTL controls. The stars on the view screen elongated, stretching into streaks of impossible blue and white. With a lurch that felt like the ship was being torn apart and put back together again, the rust bucket leaped into the non-space of faster-than-light travel. The image of the glimmer ship, tumbling and broken, and the burning, glassed world of Tartarus 7 vanished behind them. They were adrift. 24 survivors in a beaten-up salvage rig, alone in the infinite, silent ocean of the galaxy. They had no home to return to, no destination in mind. They had nothing but the ship, the memories of the fallen, and the data chip still slotted in the console. Lena ejected it carefully, holding it in her palm. It wasn't just a reboot sequence or a weapon. It was a testament. They were the salvaged, pulled from the wreckage of a forgotten moon, saved by the ingenuity of a man who saw value in the broken. They were the masterpiece he had built from their own pain. They would not be silent. They would carry their noise, the messy, beautiful, chaotic song of humanity, to the stars, not as a weapon anymore, but as a warning. A story told to the darkness of a small, primitive species that was chosen to be a work of art and chose instead to be the artist of their own. Defiant fate. The hunt was over. The gallery was closed. And somewhere, in the endless quiet, the survivors began to make a new kind of noise, the sound of a future being built, one piece of scrap at a time.